I am very excited to be here, so thank you for having me. I hope I cover everything that fills all of your expectations. We'll kind of go over that, but just to give you guys a little bit of background about myself. So I'm currently working as clinical social work faculty at WVU Medicine. I'm in the Chestnut Ridge building, and I have a long history of working with children and families. I started off doing in-home services, working with at-risk kids who are being placed outside of their home. And then I moved into specializing in infant mental health. And so that's where my heart kind of lies, is working with infant mental health. And now I teach that. So I'm endorsed as an infant mental health specialist, and I work primarily with women who are struggling with a substance use disorder in our MAT program, and the relationships with their children. I do some consultative work on our NICU and our MIC, in helping building bonding and attachment, but COVID has kind of interrupted that because now they use tele, and that's really kind of difficult with bonding and attachment. So we've not gotten too many referrals with that, but that's kind of where we're at. So today I'm going to talk about the impact of trauma in pregnancy and early childhood. Some of the context that I'm going to focus around is substance use disorder. So looking at a substance use disorder within the family, how that impacts early childhood, how important some of that attachment is early on, what those stressful situations look like, how stress can impact those relationships, and also building resiliency. I'm going to go over some tips and techniques, probably that a lot of you are already doing and don't even realize what a fabulous job you're doing. But going over some of that just to kind of give you some ideas of some tools. A lot of the times we go to trainings and get tons of information and learn about situations, but we don't get tools to kind of help us, like practical tools. So I like to call that practical magic, and I love to provide some practical magic. So feel free to interrupt me throughout this presentation. It is better when you guys participate. I'm all about stopping and asking questions. So what are you hoping to get from this? What would you, is there any dire topic that you're hoping I cover, or something specific that you hope I cover? Anybody have anything? No? Well, that makes my job easy. Okay, so then I will just move forward. And if you think of something, go ahead and let me know or put it in the chat. So I'm going to start with attachment, and starting from the very beginning. This is one of my favorite definitions of attachment because it talks about building that emotional bond, not only at one time, but across time, right? So across that time and space. We know that it is so important for that early attachment. We know that it's critical within those first few moments of babies to be with their caregiver, with their mother, have that skin to skin. We know that that early attachment is significant in life. But keeping and maintaining that attachment across time and space is really important as well. And sometimes we can lose sight of that, and especially when there's disruptions within the attachment. It makes it more difficult to reattach, but it's not impossible. And so keeping that in mind, that we can still do that. Secure attachment definitely matters. It has lifelong impacts, right? So we know that if that early attachment doesn't occur, it's going to have some lifelong impacts. So these are like the building blocks. So that attachment is the building blocks that keeps adding on to that social competence, that empathy building, the ability to learn, be educated, develop. So it's so significant early on. Prenatal attachment is just as important, and it starts from the minute that a woman knows she's pregnant. And it increases throughout the pregnancy. So that prenatal attachment can increase as the rates and rhythms start to become in line. Babies memorize their mom's rates and rhythms, right? So those cortisol levels, when mom's stressed, baby knows that. By the third trimester, baby can hear two voices outside of mom's voice and recognize those voices. So we know that there is an attunement early on. And so that prenatal attachment is huge, and it has a positive outcome later on. So that postnatal development, the more that a mom attaches in utero while she's pregnant, the better outcomes she'll have. There are some studies that show that negative association can impact with symptoms of anxiety and depression, not only with mom, but the baby as well. And so we know that that has an impact. Becoming pregnant can help with that attachment, right? And so we know that if it's planned or unintended, has different outcomes at times. Planned, this is a mom that's been waiting for this relationship, has been waiting for this new life to come and building it and looking forward to it. And sometimes when it's unintended, we have a mom that can have considerable stress with that, worrying about what to do, when to do it, how to handle this, can she handle this, what's going to happen? And this can lead to an increased risk of mental health, especially when you're working with a mom with a substance use disorder. This can be a scary time. If it's an unintended pregnancy and it's early on within the pregnancy, a lot of the times moms will tend to ignore that, right? And so out of sight, out of mind, and that can turn away from the attachment and also can make for an unhealthy living environment. I have a lot of moms that have struggled and went back to using when they found out they were pregnant because they just couldn't handle it, right? They couldn't cope with that. And that's one of the difficulties. And so we know that that can cause unconsiderable stress in the very beginning. And we know that in the first trimester, the baby's most vulnerable to toxic stresses and to any kind of toxicity. So that's really important to help mom from the very beginning. So reorganization, this is when the mom is starting to reorganize. So once the pregnancy has been identified, she's starting to attach, she's starting to now explore what kind of mother she's going to be. She's going to reorganize from being a daughter to a mother. You're looking at mothers reorganizing as far as being maybe a single parent, like a single person, to now a dyad. Huge change, big change. You're looking at a dyad becoming a triad when the partner's involved. If there's other children, you're looking at that expansion. And so it's a whole reorganization that starts to happen during pregnancy. If a mother is ignoring that and not really gaining perspective of that, then a lot of the times that can come as a higher stress later on. And so starting to reorganize is a natural step in the first trimester. And then object relationship starts to occur, especially in the third trimester, right? Because this is when mom can start to feel the baby. And now that emotional energy that was outward is turned inward. It's like, oh my gosh, there is a baby in there. And so really starting to identify that. It's also a time when a mother starts to think of, what kind of mother am I going to be? And then can't help but reflect on what kind of parents they had as well. And so when reflecting, a lot of the times we're dealing with families, especially when we're working with substance use disorder, we're dealing with families that have complex and generational trauma. And so a lot of the times they didn't have very great mothers or very great examples. They had different caregivers, maybe grandparents. And so a lot of the times this reflection piece can create a disconnect. And so many of the times we work with women to kind of process through this, because it's that intergenerational trauma, right? It can repeat itself if we don't manage it. And so starting to identify themselves as what kind of mother they're going to be. And we all do it. Everybody who has children does that, right? You think of like, oh man, I'm not doing this. My mom did this and I'm definitely not doing this. Or you think like, okay, I can't wait to do that with my kids, right? So you start to really think and organize your thoughts as identifying what type of mother you want to be. But that intergenerational trauma can linger, and that can be really difficult for a lot of moms. So a lot of the times that generational trauma, if we don't heal that, then what happens is they repeat a pattern. And so a lot of the times you'll see some of that surface later on in different ways. I don't think I put the example. No, I didn't. I took it out because I was afraid of time. But one of the examples that I had put in there was, a case study of a mom who was 22 and her baby had failure to thrive. She was in recovery for 2 years, and she was really struggling with thoughts of a relapse, But after really getting to know mom and process through a lot, after the relationship was built and she was able to really reflect on what was going on was that she grew up in a family of violence. Her father was abusive. There was domestic violence. He wasn't really violent towards her a whole lot, but he still was. And she witnessed a whole lot of domestic violence. And so what it came down to was she had said that her whole family was violent, and she was afraid that with those urges and feelings of wanting to relapse, she was afraid that she would become violent towards her infant. And so after working through those, the infant started, those issues, the infant started doing better and thriving. But that took a long time to get there. And so building that relationship and really getting to some of that underlying trauma is important. I don't know if you all have heard Ghosts in the Nursery. So Ghosts in the Nursery was an article that Frailberg has I don't know if it's still out there or not, but she talks about ghosts in the nursery and kind of what presents from that. So that's a really good article. So I always put this slide in there, dads matter, right? So when we talk about moms and babies, it's kind of hard. It feels like we leave dads out. And so I don't want to leave that out. I really want to talk about how impactful it is when you have both parents. That's a protective factor. Having both parents is definitely a protective factor, and dads have a huge impact. We know from the literature and we know from the education that when dads are involved, that we see kids, even if the parents aren't together, when a dad is presently involved in a child's life, we see kids who have reduced aggression, a higher threshold to graduate from school. We see kids who are able to manage stress and stressful situations. And so having an involved father really impacts that social emotional development. Not to mention some of that rough and tumble play that fathers can provide. That's really important for kids. It's really important for their development in early childhood to regulate those emotions and learn how to handle that situation. Now that can backfire sometimes. It all depends. I had a kid who had intellectual disabilities, and that rough and tumble play was how him and dad connected. And what ended up happening was that's how he tried to connect with a lot of his peers. So he would go and have and he was getting in trouble for being too aggressive. And so we had to work on shifting dad and the little boys' interactions. And that was not easy, because for dad, that was their time. Like wrestling was their time. And so that was a really difficult shift to do. But when dad noticed they still had a connection and a pattern of interaction outside of that, he felt more comfortable with it. But it took some time. So disruption and early attachment. It affects regulation, and that's the huge piece. That's what we're seeing in a whole lot of kids today. And, their inability to really get along with others and play with others. We're seeing kids that are getting kicked out of daycares with aggressive behaviors. And this leads to, when you have a lot of these behaviors and acting out because of their disruption and early attachment, then this leads to later learning problems. We can see them not being able to focus and concentrate, not really sitting still to learn. And then sometimes even later psychopathology as well. So that, that can mean depression, anxiety, aggression. So you have all of this without a substance use disorder, and now add a substance use disorder into that can be really difficult. We know that within a family, a substance use disorder doesn't just occur with one individual, and that's why family treatment has best results for a substance use disorder. It's a parallel process, and it occurs across the board. So if you look at just this kind of frame, denial, change, relapse, recovery, it's not just the individual that goes through denial. You notice that the whole family kind of does, right? And so you don't have an individual that says, I don't really have a problem. Sometimes you have parents that say, they're not there. They don't really have a problem. They just use at parties, or, so you have a whole nother level of denial. Or even when there's kids involved, kids kind of denying that their parents are using a drug, or, maybe they're just sick or, you know, they come up with all kind of excuses. So it's not just the individual, but it's the whole family system. And then when you move to change, the change is the greatest piece, but it can also be one of the most difficult. So when an individual is in recovery and they're going to change, they're motivated to change, they're motivated to manage their substance use disorder, they're changing their patterns of interactions. And for kids, 3 and under, well, 5 and under really, they memorize patterns of interactions. That's their whole world. And so when they have already memorized a pattern of interaction, good or bad, they know how to manage that. And sometimes when they have had inconsistent patterns of interaction early on, they become hypervigilant to emotions, right? It's a protective factor, and that's how they manage. But now this is going to change. Now the parent's a little more aware. So for example, if you had a baby that maybe they didn't get tended to every time, they didn't get a bottle every time they cried, or they have had to scream in order to get any type of attention, or they had multiple caregivers. Let's say this changes, right? Let's say their parent gets into recovery and now they're consistently meeting their needs, they're consistently interacting with them, they're the only caregiver. That's a loss for that child at that point, right? And they don't know how to handle it because they've memorized patterns of interaction. And so this is different for them, good or bad. And it means that their whole world is changing. And so a lot of the times, this is where you'll see a huge increase in child's behaviors. And so when a parent is really working towards recovery, it can be really stressful and difficult because many of the times, especially in toddlers, this is where you get an increase in behaviors. They are going to push it to the next level, to the possible extent that they can, just to see if this is going to stick or what's really going on here. Can I trust this? And so this is a really difficult time where parents in recovery really need support. And then, you know, you also have the relapse component. And, you know, in recovery, we say expect relapse. I had a mom who was 8 years in recovery, and she was so worried about that relapse component. She was definitely aware of it. And she said, listen, do we have to relapse when we're in recovery? And I said, no, you don't have to, but that's just in there. To expect that that can happen, right? Doesn't mean you're in active addiction again if you've relapsed. But the difficult piece with that is that your pattern of interaction has changed. And so, and you're building with your family. And so even for family members that help individuals out when they're struggling with substance use disorder, if they are used to this new person who is motivated to change, really taking care of themselves, then they relapse, that trauma is going to come in full force, right? They're going to think of them all the way back to their worst days and worry that they're going to go back there. And so you almost have to start all the way over again and building that trust and interaction, and especially with kids as well. I had a little kid, 5 years old, and he didn't articulate it the way I'm going to say it, but when he processed it, he had, you know, his mom sought out treatment, and she talked about how, you know, when she was in active addiction, her patterns of interaction and what he was used to. And he was able to say that he knew if mommy left, that she would be good. And so when we processed that, what she was able to piece together, what he was kind of verbalizing, was that when she was dope sick and would leave to go get high, he was okay with that. And at times he pushed his behavior to get her to leave so that when she come back, she would play, because once she was fine, she would play with him. And she had to do a lot of work around this because it broke her heart naturally to hear this. But that's how he remembered it. And he didn't remember if it was a day, a week, or however long. And it was different times that, you know, at different events in their lives, but they really worked hard on that. And so, but he was able to articulate that, which is pretty amazing. And so just looking at it as a whole, as the whole family system. And recovery is ongoing, right? It's ongoing. And I will tell you that and you guys probably experience this too and see it all the time, but the guilt that these parents hold from using during pregnancy, especially the mothers who have used in pregnancy or even early on in a child's life, is huge. And that is one of the biggest barriers to help them overcome that guilt and shame. So they already hold it. And then we have, you know, other stigmatizing situations where sometimes providers shame them. And that's even more difficult. And it actually turns them away from treatment. So when you're looking at the stages of change, these are the stages of change that someone with a substance use disorder will go through. And so a lot of the times we talk about how individuals go into treatment several times, and this is why, because if they're not motivated to change, they're not going to. So we need them to get to that contemplation stage where they're ready and prepared to work, and then they go into action. And a lot of the times what treatment can do, even if a person's not motivated to change, let's say they're court ordered to go to treatment or they're forced to go to treatment, a lot of the times treatment facilities use motivational interviewing to get them to that place of change. So it can be beneficial, but sometimes they're just not in the right state of mind and they're not ready to change. They have to want to change. For women who struggle with a substance use disorder, it can be a little more difficult because we know that, women are usually a primary caregiver. They're usually, if they're not the caregiver of their children, sometimes they're caregivers of other people. Sometimes they're caregivers of a brother or grandparents. And we know that there's a lot of grandparents taking care of kids today, but especially in rural Appalachia, that's nothing new. That's been happening. So, a lot of the times the mothers we're dealing with were raised by their grandparents. And so you have some of those natural caregivers. So they need more weekend, evening appointments. That's not always available. We know that women in treatment, like we talked about, have that guilt that they hold on to, especially mothers who have just held on to that guilt. They tend to isolate. They don't want to be around anybody. They don't want to hear, what they're doing wrong. And so they do tend to isolate. And we want to get them to open up. A lot of the times what we do is we do like, I make them do oh my goodness, I totally lost the word, like a field trip. They go to a field trip, like to a library or to the school. So I make them kind of open up communication with school if their children are school age, to help them be reintegrated into the community, right? They need those supports. They need healthy supports. With substance use disorder, it's all about people, places, and things. So we teach all the time, you have to change people, places, and things. And many of the times when relapse is involved, it has to do with people, places, and things. And so people are the biggest piece that you have to create boundaries with. And a lot of the times, the unhealthy people in their lives are their families and their supports. And so we're looking at re-engaging healthy supports for them and how to find that, helping them find that. We know that a lot of women are involved with partners who have a substance use disorder as well. And so that places them at a little bit of a greater risk as well. And we know that there are higher risk factors for kids who have two parents that are involved with a substance use disorder. And so we really want to kind of look at that, pay attention, and look at how we can increase some of those protective factors, because those kids are at greater risk for having a substance use disorder themselves. So the risk factors for families with a substance use disorder are naturally impaired attachment. We talk about economic hardships, the lack of supports. A lot of them have legal problems that follow them, and emotional distress. So that emotional distress is huge. So with these risk factors on top of, the adverse childhood experience risk factors, sometimes if you look at, if you just look at these risk factors and think of the families you're working with, I know the families I work with, they definitely have more than 2 or 3 of these, right? And so they have higher risk factors, and these higher risk factors place the children at a higher risk. And so really looking at how we can help these families, how we can intervene, can be really important. I had a mom just this week, and she's probably one of my hardest working moms. I just love her. But, she's starting to identify these risk factors, and, she's not in active addiction, but she's like my genes are bad. I've had that, my kids have had multiple caregivers, and how are these medical problems not my fault? I exposed them to violence, right? We've lived in a terrible place where I know there was mold growing. And so, just really that guilt factor that comes into play, especially when they start to recognize some of their own risk factors. But what I try to do is shift them towards noticing the protective factors, like what are you doing for this child right now? How are you helping them? Violence is a huge one. So we know that violence can completely restructure the brain in utero. So a baby who is exposed to violence, even in utero, it can start restructuring that entire brain. And we know that a lot of women who are involved with a substance use disorder are involved with domestic violence. I had a group one time of 13 women, and 11 of them were either involved in a domestically violent situation a couple times or currently. And so, you know, the numbers are just great and they're there. And it's really important to acknowledge that domestic violence increases that stress reactivity, which increases stimulation and completely creates dysregulation for babies. And so that is a very toxic brew in utero. It's really important. One of the, there's a book, and it's a second part of Ghosts in the Nursery. It's called Ghosts from the Nursery. This is the nice thing about webinars, right? You're like right in your office and I can pull all these resources. So it's called Ghosts from the Nursery. And for those of you who have not read that, it's a pretty good book. It talks about the impact of violence on the brain structure in utero. And it also talks about the impact of other substances in utero. It talks about the impact of marijuana, crack cocaine, alcohol, and nicotine, and how that impacts baby's brain development in utero. We don't have a whole lot of research on opiates or methamphetamines because what we're running into now, I mean, we can hypothesize knowing how some other substances have impacted baby's brain, but that's really all we have. We don't have any hardcore literature on that because we're having a hard time. A lot of the moms that are involved with substance use disorder right now are involved in polysubstances. And so we can't narrow it down to one substance, right? And so that's really difficult to kind of assess right now. So bringing in trauma, a lot of the women that we work with substance use disorder, we know have complex trauma, and complex trauma is very difficult. About 80% of women have complex trauma, and it stems from betrayal from a caregiver. And this can mean abandonment. It can mean neglect. It can mean, you know, the caregiver using themselves. There's a wide variety of meanings under this. We know that it stems from maltreatment, from different loss, exposure to violence, huge one again. But complex trauma is linked to emotional attunement. And what do we need from moms when they have babies? Or that emotional attunement. And so you have all of these moms who are exposed to this trauma, not to mention possible intergenerational trauma that may be surfacing that can create these barriers to just building a relationship with their child. And that's huge. There are many different types of trauma, including, you know, medical trauma, early childhood trauma. So a lot of those impact as well. And trauma can be a one-time event, or it can be something that, you know, a chronic exposure to trauma. And that's mainly what we're seeing. So when you talk about complex trauma, that's what that is. It's a chronic exposure to a violent situation or a traumatic situation. For caregivers in recovery, this is a huge barrier, because not only do they have these barriers of emotional attunement to kind of overcome, but they also have this, you know, sometimes these babies can be less rewarding. They're more difficult to care for at times. They're not as easy to soothe. And for a mother in recovery, they need to have that rewarding system. They need those endorphins to start happening so that they can start to rewire their brain and have that natural release to help them within their road to recovery. And one of the biggest things that does that is when they're able to meet their child's needs. So when you have a parent that's not able to meet their child's need, this is less rewarding. The girl I was talking about today, She's 3 weeks in and she's like, I can't read her cries. I can't tell when it's, you know, a cry for hunger or she needs changed, and I can think about it, but I can't read them. And I said, you're not supposed to until 6 weeks, right? You're not going to identify the differences in the cries until 6 weeks. And it was like a ton of energy was released, right? She's like, oh, okay. That makes more sense for me. Like, so she was holding herself to these limits, and really placing a lot of expectation on herself that developmentally the baby wasn't there. She shouldn't be there, right? And so really just helping them go through this, because it leads to that self-worth, feeling hopeless. They start to feel like they're not good parents. The one thing in the world they feel like they can be as good parents, and then when they're not able to meet some of the baby's needs due to other issues, then they feel like that self-blame comes back up. So huge barrier. This can mean, naturally for babies and children, this can mean a disruption in their attachment, right? Placing kind of that wedge there. Early life stressors. It's important for babies to stress, but not have toxic stress. So we'll go into that a little bit. We want babies to have positive stress. There's positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. We want babies to have positive stress. We want them to struggle a little bit. We want them to cry a little bit and learn to regulate. That's how they grow and develop. We want children to. We want toddlers to get frustrated with shapeshifters, right? Not being able to get it in and hitting it over and over again. We want them to dysregulate and regulate again. And so that positive stress is important. That's something else we run into a lot of the times too. Once a parent's in recovery, is because of that guilt they hold, they don't allow their kids to have any stress. So they almost try to eliminate any stress they have, and they become over involved. And we talk about allowing that stress to occur so that they can regulate. But what happens with substance use disorder is now a parent is dealing with these flood of emotions where they have to learn to regulate themselves. And so it's really difficult to be in tune when you're learning to regulate your own emotions and then your child's as well. And so just taking some time for that. Inconsistent parenting, unpredictable routines, multiple caregivers. So we want to help with that. We want to make sure. So if anything, babies need consistency, predictability, and involvement. And so they need that in order to feel safe and secure and to develop. If not, all of that neurological energy is going to go towards just developing. So that goes into the developing, a baby's brain. So what they need is they need their basic physical needs met, communication, relationships, and stimulation. A baby is born with all of the neurons they'll ever need in life, but they need synapses that fire and wire those neurons together. And so it's a use it or lose it kind of method, right? They need to use it and have this interaction, this positive interaction. It fires and wires it together. And that's why trauma is a physical response too, because what happens sometimes for kids who don't have some of that positive interaction, sometimes when they have a negative interaction, that also fires and wires together. That leads to implicit memories. And so what happens is their body remembers it. So there's a trauma book, it's called Your Body Takes the Toll, or Your Body Keeps the Toll, I think it is. Or Your Body Keeps the Score, that's what it is. So it's a book, and it talks about how that early childhood trauma really impacts them, has a dysregulation, and so that implicit memory fires and wires together. So then when they feel that again, it takes them all the way back to their early trauma. And that's why a lot of the times when we're seeing toddlers who have had some of that early trauma completely dysregulate at times, and something triggers them and we have no clue what triggers them, because we don't understand fully sometimes what they've been through. But a lot of the times it's some of this early trauma that's really kind of setting them off and causing some disruption within their brain. So this is The Whole Brain Child, is a great book by Dan Siegel too. Talks about childhood trauma. But have you guys seen the brain model, like with the hand, right? So let me turn it this way. So our brains develop from the bottom to the top. And so this on this slide, you see this staircase, and the staircase is the amygdala, right? That's the piece that kind of bridges between our downstairs brain and our upstairs brain. And our downstairs brain has that fight, flight, or freeze kind of mode, and it's an emotional response. It has where we should, it tells our body where to breathe, how to respond. And then we have that staircase to like our thinking, decision making, postural control, empathy, all of that up top. Well, for kids who are 5 and under, this whole top is completely under construction. There's no roof, there's holes all over the place. Even their staircase has some holes too. When you add trauma, it's even more difficult and underdeveloped, right? And so what's happening a lot of the times is, let's say something happens to a toddler, right, that causes them to have extreme emotions. Typical toddler interaction. Some kid comes and takes the toy that they wanted or they're playing with. And so what's going to happen is they're going to respond emotionally. And so they might get a little frustrated, or you might see some kids flip their lid, right? And so we talk about flipping their lid. When they flip their lid, there's no decision making to any of that emotion. So saying, why are you crying? What's going on? They can't tell you. No way. We have to calm them down first before we can have any type of discussion with them. Now, for kids who might have been exposed in utero or have some early childhood trauma, some complete dysregulation, what happens is they're already a little agitated. And so it might just take something small to hit that emotional piece for them to flip their lid. And that's why we're seeing kids dysregulate so easily, become so impulsive. They're in this constant state of arousal. And so it's that fight, flight, or freeze, right? And that's when and they learn these patterns of interactions as infants and early on. And not only when they're threatened, but when their whole caregiver system is threatened. So that's why domestic violence has a huge impact, right? That's the caregiver system. A lot of the times that's happening right in front of them. And I think that might be my biggest pet peeve is when someone says, oh, they were too young to know. And I'm like, no, they're never too young to know. So they feel that, right? They might be too young to remember cognitively, but they felt it. They knew what was going on. And a lot of the times when kids, and it's a protective factor, when they're exposed to this toxic, because what happens is it impacts their fear response, right? And so when they're constantly being ignited and activated as a fear response, they dysregulate. They then don't know how to differentiate between that. And it can lead to stress reactivity. Again, back to those stress levels. We want kids to have positive stress. Tolerable stress, they can manage too. Doesn't have too much of an impact on the brain development. Tolerable stress is like when a kid might experience the loss of like somebody important to them, an animal, and then they're kind of told it's going to be okay, that reassurance, those protective factors. But toxic stress is when they're faced with that bear constantly, time and time again, right? And so that's that hyper arousal. And so a lot of the times when kids are faced with that or in those situations, that's how they base everything. So if you're feeling anxious or upset and you come into their home, you better guarantee they're probably going to know it before you know it, because that's their hyper arousal. They're built to kind of know that because it's a protective factor for them. But it definitely impacts their brain development and their ability to regulate. And so we need that. In order for kids to learn to regulate, they need to have those external supports that respond to this and reduce that fear response. And so they're there to support it and bring down that fear response and extinguish it so that it's not a constant hyper arousal. This is where that internal working model starts to go, where they start to calm themselves down, remember that they can know, right? So these are those implicit memories that they remember. If they cry, mom or dad's going to come and change my diaper. If I cry, mom and dad's going to come and give me a bottle, right? If I cry for hours, if I throw something, then they'll do it, right? And then that's a lot of times where you get kids with some behaviors. So increased stress levels, there's an increased risk naturally with stress levels. And so you can imagine parents having an increased stress level definitely impacts the child. So when the child has high stress levels and parents have high stress levels, then it's it's a perfect storm there. We talk about, so this is from SAMHSA in 2002. I've looked for a similar chart that's more updated, but they don't have one. I would love to see it. But it shows, you know, postpartum depression as the highest toxic stress for children. Does anybody know why? Anybody have a wild guess? Well, for postpartum depression, a lot of the times parents aren't present, right? They're physically there, they're tending to the child, but they're not present. And so this is where it can increase some of that toxic stress. The same thing with parental substance abuse. Have you guys ever saw the still face experiment? Yeah. I'm going to show you guys this real quick so we can show another one, but this kind of shows you kind of what that response is.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And the still face experiment that the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions. They turn away. They feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
So you can see how quickly that baby re-engages, right? If we were assessing them for attachment, it would definitely be a healthy attachment because that baby was soothed automatically by mom. But yeah, so this shows you how that kind of, you know, that flat affect can impact babies. And when you think about postpartum depression, that's kind of what babies get, is that flat affect. When you think about substance use disorder, at times parents are not there. You know, they can be nodding off at times. I showed this in my group at one point, and the mothers just cried, and they talked about like how, you know, and naturally goes to that guilt of what they put their kids through. And so we quickly reshift that so that they focus on what they can do to help build, mend, and repair that relationship, right? So how about this one, right? So this kind of shows what we're faced with today with electronics and screen time and how it's impacting babies. Same responses. do you guys think about that? Like, what sits with you when watching both of those? Anybody? I love how the baby looked to the recorder, right? The person that's recording, like, what is she doing? She's not even paying attention to me. What's going on? But you can see how screens can definitely impact that relationship as well. How do you think you would prepare for your next visit? Do you think you would address this? Say something?
I think it was interesting in the first video how quickly the baby reacted to the mom's face showing no emotion.
Yeah. 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 And in the still face, the baby responds really quickly. It took this baby a little bit of time, but yeah, in the first one, she responded really quickly. Anybody else?
I wonder if it would be helpful to show that to moms. Because like you said, when you show it in your group, when you talk about preparing yourself for the next visit, I almost think that by showing it would be more impactful than talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, it's a little difficult when doing home visiting, but in the outpatient setting, we have that capability to record. And that's a lot of what infant mental health is. We're recording those patterns of interaction and then sitting down with the parent and showing them where those cues were and where they could have missed. And looking at that. But you're right, like I think this is a great learning example and how it impacts. But I think it's important, you know, especially with moms who are struggling with substance use disorder, like we talked about that guilt. I think it's important to quickly shift them to focus on what they can do, right? So not holding on to that guilt, but more or less what you can do now to mend and repair that relationship. So we want to help reduce caregiver stress. I focus a lot on reducing that, helping them reduce that, looking at how they can reduce that. Sometimes it's a routine, increasing their one-on-one time. You see those babies love it, right? Exploring who they leave their kids with, right? A lot of the times moms in recovery won't leave their kids with anybody. And so one of the discussions we have is who can you leave your kid with? And so exploring that, limiting media exposure to violence. Like, I can't tell you how many kids, and I still have not watched it. Every time I talk about this, I say I'm going to watch it, but I can't tell you how many kids have reduced aggressive behaviors just by parents turning off violent cartoons. Like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, I've not watched the new ones, but some of the kids, like I see a pattern with kids that watch that with aggressive behaviors. So they must be pretty aggressive. But as providers, we can help, and we can help by identifying what feelings we bring to the situation, right? We want to make sure that we're engaging authentically. What does our body language say? Are we building that trusting relationship, especially with trauma? I had a supervisee that just told me the other day that, you know, she started trauma treatment with a little kid and they're in their third session. And she's like, they're not going anywhere. They're not going to. You have to build that trusting relationship. And for trauma kids, it's even harder. It takes a long time to build that therapeutic alliance before you can move forward or before they'll move forward in doing any work. Positive thoughts promote positive interactions. So just making sure that you as a provider are thinking positively about the situation. We all have some of those families that get on our nerves and drive us crazy, and we want to have that safe space of somewhere to kind of process that. But if we're always talking bad about a family, that's going to reflect. So really changing those thoughts to a more positive thinking and positive interaction. Again, that alliance, that relationship between the healthcare professional and that patient is important. It's primary. And if you feel stuck or feel like you're not going anywhere, you're not achieving any goals, always go back to that therapeutic alliance. That's really important. Engagement is key, right? That's what you need to build that relationship. And you're not going anywhere if you don't have that engagement. So I'm not gonna show you guys this one for the sake of time. but you can look it up. For those of you who have not seen it, it's Brene Brown's video on empathy. Have you guys seen that? It's a great video. It talks about not silver lining, and so it's just so funny. Having a strength-based approach, so really looking at the qualities that this parent holds, that they're doing well. It is so easy for us as providers to quickly go to and identify everything that they could be doing better or the deficits they have to improve, but really looking and exploring what they could be doing well, helping them identify resources and how to have some more support and opportunities. This is important. A lot of the times families will come in and they'll say, I have nobody, right? And so I'll sit down and actually do like an eco map with them, go over who's in their lives and if it's a positive influence or a negative influence, and how we bring those positive influences closer to us. So we talk about where you position them and how to bring them closer to you and how to build those relationships. And sometimes they need those steps. Exploring and building their sensitivity. So starting to be more sensitive to situations. Looking at parenting behaviors. Where are those positive behaviors? Teaching parents to parent from a distance. A lot of moms I work with don't have custody of their children, or they only get visitation. And a lot of the times their focus is on that, right? So they're like, oh, they have a diaper rash again. And I know that foster mom is just not washing them. And I can't help but check it every time, right? And so we talk about the emotions that builds. Like you have 2 hours with your baby. And you're building that aggression from the very beginning, and that's what you're holding during this time frame. What do you want from this time frame? And so looking at how they can build that bonding and attachment in the little time frame that they have, and parenting from a distance, it's important. Mending and repairing their relationships, especially when it's been later on, right? And so kids who are toddlers now coming back home or living with them full time. And so learning to mend and repair those relationships to build some of those trusting relationships again. Teaching some basic techniques, like I said, practical magic. Nobody wants to admit they don't know how to do something. And a lot of the times these parents don't know how to build these relationships. They have some of that intergenerational trauma. And so many of the times they don't know what to do appropriately. We did our group did like a whole series on child-directed interaction and learning how to positively interact with their kids. And I had a mom drop out, and she came to me after, and she felt so bad about dropping out. And she said to me, she said, listen, I just can't do it. She said, I cannot talk positively to my kids. Nobody ever talked positive to me. She talked about how, her dad called her a little asshole, and like how this is the way they interacted. And I just can't do it. I just can't talk positively to my kids. And we processed it, and I tried to motivate her towards it, but she could not do it. It just made her so extremely uncomfortable. The good thing is she stayed an individual to work on her own stuff. She just couldn't do those parenting pieces. So sometimes some little techniques that you feel like you're doing seem small, but they're huge, and they have such a huge impact. So take that time and do some of that. The one thing I like to hit on this slide too is learning, teaching parents to learn that ambivalence, right? To understand that they can feel unsure about parenting, and that's normal. They can feel like they dislike their kids at times. That's okay. It doesn't mean that they're always feeling that way. And so really exploring that with them. This was one of the moms that had explained how much this impacted her, because like she said, having intervention at that time when her baby was born, she needed somebody to point out these positives, to focus on what she was doing right. Because what happens is we notice, like she said, the judges, CPS, everybody notices everything she's doing wrong. But what about the 10 things she's doing right? Nobody notices those things. And so she had said, I needed somebody to love me when I couldn't love myself. And this helped me love my baby more. So does anybody know what hormone this shows? Any guesses? So this is oxytocin. I always get people that say, I can't believe they put that 2-month-old through a MRI just for that. Well, the 2-month-old was already going through the MRI. So the mother was a neuroscientist, and she took advantage of the situation to show that love hormone, right? This is the love hormone, and it shows what it does not only for the mother, but the baby, and how much it lights up within that brain development. And so it's huge. So we talk about the protective factors, and I'm going to go through these super quick, but I'll give you guys my slides so that you can have that. The protective factors, these are CDC's 4 protective factors that they put out to counteract the adverse childhood experiences, and telling us what we can do to help families, right? What's been identified. Helping them with concrete resources is one. Just finding some of those resources will help reduce some of that stress. Strengthening the support systems. We talked about how these women tend to isolate significantly. So helping them identify supports, linking them to community supports, encouraging different family connections, healthy ones, support groups. They talk all the time about how the support groups really help them. They complain about it, but I have people that show up no matter what. Emotional and psychological resilience of the caregivers. So talking about problems that we see, discussing treatment options, and remaining emotionally available, just listening sometimes. Parenting education and tips is really important, providing, and that's something great that you all do already. Social emotional development, talking about how to do that. We talk about using emotional language, emotional scaffolding. Sometimes they need specifics on how to do that. And so being very practical about what we're providing. Understanding their child's social, emotional, and cognitive capacities. I have moms, when we talk about social, emotional development and growth, I have moms that say, listen, who teaches this? Who tells us about this? Because when we go to the doctors, they tell us everything, all the developmental milestones our kids need to meet, but not these social, emotional pieces. So becoming more emotionally in tune and how to handle that, how to provide a safe, secure environment. Because we know that building resiliency can impact so many pro-social behaviors, right? Sharing, learning, taking turns. It builds trusting adults. They start to recognize thoughts and feelings earlier, regulate emotions. So we know that it's really important. I'm so sorry, we ran out of time. I don't have time to ask you all what you've learned today, but I really hope that you've learned something from this presentation. I know this is something that you all are already very active in, but just remembering that it's easier to build from the beginning. So a lot of the work that you do is so important. And so, you know, just being positive and shifting that way and remembering how impactful you're being.